Welcome dear students to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. K.S. Nagaraja of Deccan College, Pune, teaching the course Historical Linguistics. Today we look at the concept of classification of languages or language classification. The issue of classification comes up when we see that there are more than one language. As soon as we are faced with more than one language, the question of whether they are similar or dissimilar becomes apparent. So, in this particular module, we try to understand what criteria can be useful in identifying whether two or more languages could be grouped in one set or one family concept, or not. So, here the concentration is more to introduce the concepts, and they will be developed further in the other modules. Among the large number of criteria according to which languages might be classified, 3 have been found fruitful. 1, type; 2, proximity; and 3, common descent. The first one provides typological classification, the second one provides areal classification, and the third provides genetic classification. One of the earliest methods of comparing languages was to take data from many languages and compare them, and as some data has been provided in this particular module. Study the following data and see whether any two or more share similarities between them. This is the first exercise to identify if any two or more languages are similar or not. We are looking at form similarity and meaning similarity. In fact, when forms are taken, we take based on a meaning. That is, a meaning identicalness should be there. Then only we can continue with that one. Compare the data from different language given below: Hindi, Marathi, Persian, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, Telugu, Kashmiri, and Khasi. The present knowledge tells us that they belong to 3 different families. Assuming that we do not know, and if we have to decide purely from the comparative vocabulary which we get for them, then automatically it is not going to be easy to decide, but then the forms, if they are really related, will show their way. For instance, for the lexical item 1, Hindi and Marathi have ek. So, being identical or being very close to each other is a sign of similarity. So, even the third form, Persian, ek, which is very similar to ek, also shows the same pattern. And when you look at the other languages, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, Telugu, the form available there is something like Vandru, Vandu, Vannu, etc. Obviously, it is very different from ek. Therefore, those forms of those languages on one side, they tells that they belong to a different group altogether. And when you come to Kashmiri, it has ak, which you can easily see that is similar to ek. So from that, we can consider Kashmiri belongs to the same group as Hindi, Marathi, and Persian. And the last one, Khasi, there the form is they or she. These forms are in no way similar to any of the earlier forms. Therefore, we assume that it should belong to totally a different group. So in this way, we take each lexical item, compare the forms between them, and see whether similarities are found or not. It is very important that the type of similarity we found in the case of one should be found in others to prove that the languages concerned belong to same group. So if you look at the form for two, do in Hindi, don in Marathi, do in Persian, all belong to same group, as you can see. Similarly, irandu, yaradu, randu, rendu in the next four languages show that they belong to a different group. In this, as far as Kashmiri is concerned, has a form called form Z. Now the Z is quite different from do or don. So here probably it is not related with the other forms of Marathi, Hindi. And similarly, Khasi again has R for two, which is very different from the rest. Coming to the form for three, we have teen, teen. Interestingly, Kashmiri is similar now, three, but Persian seems to have a totally different form, say. However, the Dravidian languages, all of them have very similar forms. Again here, Khasi is different, it has lai. Then comes the fourth item, head. Hindi has sir or sir. Marathi has doi or mund. Persian also has sir. So here we can see that even Hindi and Marathi, they have different forms. Probably historic developments may indicate why they have different forms. So at least they are not similar in this point of view. However, Persian has very similar form with Hindi. So it supports the idea that Persian goes with Hindi, for instance. And similarly, Kashmiri, which showed as if it goes with Hindi, Marathi, has a word kal for head. Again, it is quite different from the rest. And similarly, Khasi has kliye, means head, which is very different from. Next, we look at the word for ear, kan, in both Hindi and Marathi. Even Kashmiri has kan, so they are very similar, but only again Persian differs. In this case, it has gus, so it is quite different. In case of Dravidian languages, we have kad, kivi, chevi, chavi, all very similar. Of course, the first two languages have a velar stop, whereas the last two have a palatal stop. There's a very interesting sound change in between those two languages, but then that proves that they belong to same group. And Khasi again stands out, shkor, which is not similar to any. Then the item for mouth, mu in Hindi, but toned in Marathi. Dahun in Persian. Is in Kashmiri. So all are different. It appears that as far as this gloss is concerned, the languages are very different. Only the Dravidian languages stand out again in this feature, like Y, Bayi, Y. Only the Telugu has a totally different form, Nuru. And it's a very interesting development a Dravidianist has to look at. And in Khasi, it is Shinto. Again, it is different from the rest. Finally, we look at the gloss for nose, nak, in Hindi, not in Marathi. But Persian has a totally different word, bini. Interestingly, Kashmiri has similar form with the first two, nas. Their Dravidian forms are same, mukku, mugu, mukku, mukku. So they are very consistent. In fact, it shows that on one hand, all the Dravidian languages are, all the four Dravidian languages are very close to each other. Whereas the Indo-Aryan languages, Hindi, Marathi, Persian, and Kashmiri, though they are related, it appears they have changed quite a bit. And Kasi finally stands out as separate from the rest. So obviously it belongs to a totally different group. So this way, it's possible to compare languages taking lexical items and try to identify the possible groupings they end up with. But then this is only a beginning for proper comparative method, because we need to have, as was said in the earlier module, the phonetic plausibility and recurrence both have to be taken into account before finally judging given two or more languages as related, belong to same family or not. So criteria for establishing genetic relationship: 1. Agreement in the principles of syntax, morphology, and sound system alone do not provide evidence to genetic relationship. Similarly, agreement in descriptive and onomatopoeic vocabulary, as can happen accidentally or by borrowing, cannot provide evidence to genetic relationship. 3. Agreement in easily borrowable vocabulary, as can happen accidentally or by borrowing, cannot provide evidence to genetic relationship. 4. Multiple agreement in the basic and rather unborrowable vocabulary with sound correspondences which can be inherited can provide proof of genetic relationship. And last, considerable and frequent agreement in grammatical formats like endings, affixes, auxiliaries, and sound correspondences can provide proof of relationship. The family tree hypothesis presupposes successive splits of fairly homogeneous earlier stages, periods of development during which change may occur, and further splits. Through the regular recurrence of such a series of events, language families proliferate. It is assumed that after an ancestral language has split into two or more daughter languages, the speakers of the daughter languages go their separate ways linguistically and often physically. No further linguistic contact takes place between the speakers of those daughter languages. In general, language split is based on the notion of phonological restructuring. The sound system of a language is restructured when the system of phonological contrasts are altered in such a way that old contrasts are lost, new ones are introduced, or when the elements of the system are simply realigned. If one of two dialects of a language undergoes a development or a series of developments that restructures its phonological system, it can be said that the original language has split into two languages. In such a situation, the change is irreversible and a phonological system is established that is both innovative with respect to that of the parent language and distinct from those of the cognate languages. This provides a basis for subgrouping. For instance, Old Indic gives rise to Bengali, Hindi, etc. Those things we take up in a separate module. Here, a case of borrowing has been given, taken from a book written by Trask. Here, this is a case of borrowing in historic times. It's a very interesting case in the sense the languages involved are Arabic, Urdu, Turkish, Swahili, and Malay. All underwent the influence of Islam in the Middle Ages, and because of that, they have common vocabulary for news, time, book, service, beggar. Like for instance, Arabic has khabar, waqt, kitab, khidmat, fakir. And these terms are found in Urdu, Turkish, Swahili, Malay. As one can see that they are spoken in different parts of the world, as it were. Turkish, Swahili are in Africa, Malay in Malay Peninsula, Urdu, of course, in India, Arabic in West Asia, Arab countries, for instance. So the fact that these words are common in these languages is definitely not due to inheritance. It is due to borrowing these are more like some sort of cultural terms. So these have been borrowed in historic times. So the presence of these do not prove that these languages are genetically related. That's why the students should be very much aware of this kind of situation. Another case can be cited in this. This is a slightly different case. Scholars assume that Uralic languages spoken in Central Asia, particularly Ural and Altaic mountains, and Dravidian languages spoken primarily in South India and also with spreading in Central and Eastern India and a pocket in Balochistan province. Of course, we'll be studying Dravidian in a separate module later on. So the point is that scholars have tried to prove that Proto-Uralic and Proto-Dravidian are related, must have been related, and whatever they have given in the list here are cognates. But then, as they belong to very remote past, it's very difficult to prove either way. So too much distance from the present also poses problem in accepting whether the two languages or two language families concerned are related or not. So the genetic historical method classifies languages into families which have a common historic origin. If the diversification of languages has not been so remote in time as to remove all evidential traces, comparison will reveal characteristic resemblances among languages which have such a common origin. What is chiefly relevant for such comparisons is the resemblance between individual forms in languages, both with respect of forms with both sound and meaning, the relation between the two being arbitrary. In principle, any sound can express any meaning whatever. Therefore, if two languages agree in a considerable number of such items, as do, for example, Hindi and Marathi, and if the resemblances cannot be explained by borrowing, we necessarily draw a conclusion of common historic origin. Thus, a genetic classification can only be done on the basis of historical hypothesis. The second type of classification, though an older one, is based on the formal types found in the languages, is called typological classification, is based on language-specific features. Typology, so to speak, is a generalized comparative descriptive linguistics or generalized contrastive linguistics. In actual application, typological classification is quite different from the genetic classification because it is based on arbitrary features chosen as basis for synchronic comparison. Typological classification has no necessary historical implications. Typological classification, on the whole, is based on formal relationships. Language having per, the, and ka will be typologically similar to another language having pa, te, ka, provided the three consonants show similar distributions. Comparative description means the comparison of parts of two or more languages in respect of how they work without any reference to the historical considerations of whether they are genetically related or not. Since languages are to be compared in parts, linguistic typology can as well be called a typology of language features or a future typology. There is in most cases a tendency for genetically related languages to belong to the same type, but there will generally be exceptions. Moreover, many genetically unrelated languages may belong to the same type. In principle, any sound can express any meaning whatever, as said earlier. Therefore, if two languages agree in a considerable number of such items, as do, for example, Hindi and Marathi, and if the resemblances cannot be explained by borrowing, we necessarily draw a conclusion of common historic origin. Thus, a genetic classification can only be the basis of historical hypothesis. Language has many variables. It can be described as containing a complex of relations defining a set of categories to which various items of the language can be referred to as exponents. Calling such relations as features would be all right, but isolating them for typological comparison is highly artificial. Thus, isolating of such features is the main problem of typological study. In genetic classification, the basic principle is simply the recurring sound correspondence. Language that fit into regular sound correspondence belongs to the same family. Subgrouping criteria give them the degree of relationship. On the other hand, areal classifications are based on effects of language upon one another, whether they are related or unrelated. There are two types of areal classification. One, mere geographic, and two, geographic with typological similarity. In this case, we call them convergence areas. No line can be drawn between these two types, since geographically close languages are likely to share typological features, and related languages can also be close both in geography and typology. So one may talk of genetic families, typological classes, and areal groups. The three modes of classifications can thus overlap extensively. Oceanic linguistics is geographic, genetic, and typological. Southeast Asian linguistics is geographic and typological, at least because isolating tonal languages. But genetic relationship has not been established among all of them. The genetic classification operates with kinship, the areal classification with affinity, and the typological classification with isomorphism. Contrary to kinship and affinity, isomorphism does not necessarily involve either the time or the space factors. Isomorphism may unite different states of one language or two states of two languages, whether contiguous or remote, and whether cognate or not. Even though the earliest classification of languages known to linguists was typological rather than genetic, because of the firm ground on which the latter could be placed, once the possibility of talking about kinship among languages was discovered, such a study made amazing progress, whereas the questions of typology retained a speculative, pre-scientific character for a long time. Only recently could typological studies find their proper place in linguistics, and their value for synchronic studies could be properly understood. Thus, the main drawbacks of typological classifications are very clear. Languages cannot be compared as wholes. The verbal system of a language may be inflectional, whereas the nominal system of the same language can be agglutinative. Secondly, the so-called grammatical features like case, gender, person, etc. have different connotations in different languages, and a yes-no question could not be asked. Terms such as were, very commonly used in these classifications, are also misleading. In many Indo-European languages, there is a very clear grammatical distinction between a word and units of higher rank. It is identifiable by virtue of it being the unit which carries inflection. The distinction is blurred in English. For example, the king of England's daughter, according to some, like Bloomfield, it is a group word, which is a way of saying that it is like a group of words in one way, but like a single word in another. Other types of language classifications have none of these advantages. Their indeterminacies cannot readily be resolved by the provision of more data. So it may be seen that genetic classification is non-arbitrary, exhaustive, and unique. It is non-arbitrary because there is no choice of criteria leading to different and equally legitimate results. This is because such classifications reflect historic events which must either have happened or not have happened. If the classification is correct, it implies events that did occur. To summarize then, this module shows that there are three basic types of classification. Interestingly, all the three are complementary in nature rather than contrastive in nature. Though in the initial years, genetic classification gained a lot of ground over typological classification, but typological classification became more interesting to the later scholars, and when innumerable languages had to be taken into consideration, that became much more interesting than purely genetic classification. And much later, area classification became interesting, and the concept of area linguistics or convergence areas developed. So more will be discussed in the other modules.